I'm Jeff Babbitt, the Trias Director. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on this chilly and rainy mid-October night as we continue our sensational lineup for this year's Trias reading series with the brilliant and extraordinary Lacy M. Johnson. Please know that after tonight, Trias will feature Kendra Allen on November 17th and Catherine Indermar on December 1st. As with tonight, both readings are on Thursdays at 7 p.m. here in the Bartlett Theater. They are free and open to the public, so spread the word far and wide. Also, just a reminder, as much to myself as to all of you, if you could please silence your phones so that they don't go off during the reading. I'd like to thank the English department, the Writing and Rhetoric department, Sarah Kirk, and the Provost's office for their support. Thank you also to the Trias committee, Melanie Conroy Goldman, Catherine Coles, and Ben Risto. A very big thanks to Sue Gage, a worker of miracles large and small, someone who is always on top of it, who always makes everything run smoothly, and without whom nothing might ever run at all. I want to thank Peter Trias, who is truly our patron saint of creative writing here at HWS. Peter Trias graduated from Hobart College in 1970 and earned his MFA in poetry 2 years later from the Iowa Writers' Workshop. In 1976, he published a book of poems, The House in Venice. He was a man of many talents who would go on to achieve great success in real estate, among other pursuits. His generosity makes it possible to bring world-renowned writers to HWS, have them teach a workshop on campus for a semester, curate a reading series for the campus, and hold a small tutorial in the spring. So we are very lucky. The Trias program has been thriving for over a decade now, and we owe our deepest gratitude to Peter Trias for his enduring gift. And finally, I would like to thank Ed Rothfarb, Peter's life partner, who recently visited HWS and shared stories and memories of Peter with many of us here. It was wonderful to get to know him and to meet him. Thank you, Ed, for deepening and enriching an already strong bond between Peter Trias and HWS. Okay, now for our Trias writer in residence, Jenny Booley, who will introduce our headliner.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you all for coming out tonight. So, 2 parts to the intro. Of course, I'll read Lacy's standard bio, and then I will read, I guess, a homage to her work. So I am extremely humbled to be introducing Lacy M. Johnson tonight and to welcome her to the Hobart William Smith and Trias community. Lacy M. Johnson is a Houston-based professor, curator, activist, and is the author of The Reckonings, which was named a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist in criticism and one of the best books of 2018 by such places as the Boston Globe. She is also author of The Other Side, for its frank and fearless confrontation of the epidemic of violence against women. The Other Side was named a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in autobiography, among many, many other awards. It was also a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writer Selection for 2014 and was also named one of the best books of 2014 by Kirkus Library Journal and the Houston Chronicle. She is also the author of Trespasses, a memoir which has been anthologized widely in such places as The Racial Imaginary and Literature, The Human Experience. She is also the co-editor with Cheryl Beckett of More City Than Water, a Houston Flood Atlas, and Lacy M. Johnson's books are all available for purchase in the back. Lacy M. Johnson has worked as a cashier at Walmart, sold steaks door to door, and puppeteered with the Traveling Children's Museum before earning a PhD from the University of Houston's Creative Writing Program, where she was both the Earhart Fellow, and an Imprint Fondren Fellow. As an artist and writer, she has been awarded grants and fellowships from many prestigious foundations, including the Guggenheim Foundation, the Houston Endowment, Rice University's Humanities Research Center, the Houston Arts Alliance, the Sustainable Arts Foundation, and many, many, many more. And her work has appeared in many of the best anthologies and literary venues, such as the Best American Essays, the Best American Travel Writing, the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Paris Review, Orion, Tin House, Fornica, Tri-Quarterly, Gulf Coast Creative Nonfiction. It reads as any budding writer's dream. Again, I am, and she teaches creative nonfiction at Rice University and is the founding director of the Houston Flood Museum. As I said, I'm humbled to provide this introduction because as someone who has spent a great deal of her time studying, writing, and reading nonfiction, I know that Lacy M. Johnson is and will be granted a star in the universe for both her genius and her myriad forms of generosity. I fell hard for Lacy M. Johnson's writing when I first read her memoir, The Other Side. For many reasons, I felt an immediate and stark sharpness of connection to the world and events that Johnson recounts. Reading Johnson's book, I knew I was reading the work of a master. Here was a voice that so easily, it seems, merges the poetic excavation of image and language with prose that stuns with its syntax, its slow and shimmering show as it unfurls cruelties and hardships, and how a mind can rapidly shift, how a mind battered creates a new reality in order to survive. Johnson takes us to this other side of survival through her masterful rendering of fragments, her masterful ordering of sentences and paragraphs, the long journeys of her syntax, the hard hits of her short sentences. To read Johnson is to read a writer who never dispenses with the hard hits. According to the jacket copy, her most recent book, The Reckonings, Essays on Justice for the 21st Century, serves as an extended meditation on what might be an answer to the question she was often asked when giving readings from the other side. Inevitably, she'd be asked what she would like to see happen to the man who kidnapped and raped her and would have left her for dead. Women, we learn from reading this book, often approach her, saying and asking the difficult questions that women throughout their lives often don't know to ask of anything at all. I too have been one of these women. Like her writing, Johnson's answers to my queries were nothing but full of grace. She circles injustice like a hawk, zeroes in on the key culprits, goes where no woman has gone before, lands in the middle of unjust landfills, unjust classrooms, unjust waterways, unjust wars, unjust oil disasters, and delivers us into the contemporary complexities of our time with nothing less than a philosophical and sincere mind. The ways in which Johnson brings together everydayness, her past, family, research, site visits, and wondering makes me marvel at her ability to hold it all together, to keep the focus, to keep on with the hard hits. The last book I read by Johnson was her first, Trespasses. It is a beautiful rendering of kin and home and empty hands and milk bottles and silences. Today, I learned that Johnson is working towards a new collection of essays that explore wonder. I so look forward to reading it because I know that what will strike me with awe more than anything wondrous existing on earth is Johnson's own wonder. What she wonders about, The wondering of her mind is in itself a wonder to behold. Please welcome Lacy M. Johnson. I wasn't nervous before, but now I'm super nervous. Like, that's a lot to live up to. Thank you so much, Jenny. Wow, I'm speechless. I was going to read a bunch of jokes tonight, but I guess I'm going to read some serious, hard-hitting stuff now. Thank you also to Jeff. Thank you to Trias House. Thank you to, or the Trias program, excuse me. Thank you especially to Sue Gage. Is Sue here? You're Sue. Thank you, Sue, for making it possible for me to be here. And it's been a really comfortable and lovely visit so far. So I'm going to read two shorter pieces. I'm going to read the title essay of The Reckonings, just a little bit from it, and then I'm going to read something new. What do I need to say about this? I don't think that I need to say anything. I think I'll just begin. Thank you again for being here. Let me start my timer. I don't want to go over. I'm an egg. You don't want to overboil me. Okay. The Reckonings. Usually it is a woman who asks the question. Always the same question. She is sitting near the door in the last row of the auditorium, having spent the last hour listening to me talk about what it means to have once been kidnapped and raped by a man I loved. A man with whom I lived, a man who even before the kidnapping had already violated me in every way you might imagine possible, especially if you were a man like him. Someone else in the audience asks, what happened to the man? And I explain how he got away, how he is a fugitive living in Venezuela, raising a new family. This is not the ending anyone expects. Now the woman has a question. She raises her hand, and when I call on her, always last, she stands and speaks in a clear, assertive voice. What do you want to have happen to him, to the man who did this to you? By this, I know she means not only the actual crime the man committed, but also all of the therapy, the nightmares and panic attacks, the prescribed medication and self-medication, the healing and self-harm. I mean, you probably want him dead, right? No, I think. No, I say out loud. Her expression crumples. She looks confused. Everyone in the audience looks confused. This isn't supposed to be how the story ends. It's not the ending they want for themselves, for me. The women at the book club don't want this ending either. They're sitting around a long oak dining table in the home of our gracious host, who brings food out in many courses, during each of which the wine flows freely. They ask questions, mostly bookish ones, but eventually the conversation turns to the man I lived with, to how he got away. I'd kill him for you, one says. I'd kill him on the spot, says another. They carry guns in their purses, they have told me. This is Texas. I believe they are angry enough to use them. One brings up a story she heard earlier in the day. A local man has been convicted of a boy's murder. The boy was 7 when the local man raped him. He turned 8 on the day the local man burned him alive. The boy survived long enough to implicate the man, who was charged with capital murder after the boy died. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Justice has been served, one of the women in the book club says. How is this justice? Asks another. He's going to spend the next 40 years living off our taxes. He should be burned alive, the host says, the same way he tried to kill that boy. She has been quiet the entire evening, in and out of the kitchen, up and down from her chair. Now she is seated at the head of the table, looking at her hands, which twist and untwist an ironed napkin over the middle of her plate. What do you want to have happen to him? She asks me. This woman, like every other woman who asks the question, sits with her back to the wall, like I do when I have the choice.
or near the door in the last row of every auditorium I visit. Sometimes she is my mother's age, or my age. She wears oversized sweaters, little makeup, pulls back her hair in a simple bun. She does not want attention. She has children, like I do, and like I do, she sometimes struggles to love them well. She will tell me this after I finished answering questions when I am sitting at a little table signing books. She has a story that is similar to mine in ways, and she doesn't even know what to feel about it anymore. Sometimes the woman sitting near the door or against the wall is an old woman with crepe paper hands. Sometimes she is not a woman, but a man. An old man my father's age in a 10-gallon hat who tells me he was raped by an uncle when he was the age of my son. Or the person who asks the question, is a man young enough to be my son if I had started much earlier, who tells me the question is for himself or for his girlfriend. They both have a story like mine, he says, and they have not yet found an ending for it. I am surprised at how the people sitting near the door in the last row of the auditorium always have a story like mine. I carry these stories with me because I don't know what else to do with them. The details may differ. If it is not the story of an abusive lover, perhaps it is a mother or a father or an uncle. Or it is the story of a friend who has been killed by a stranger while trying to do the right thing. Or a woman who is shot in the back of the head while asking for help. It might be a story about the abuse of power or authority, of the slow violence of bureaucracy, of the way some people are born immune from punishment and others spend whole lifetimes being punished in ways they did nothing to deserve. In my story, there was a man I once loved very much. And because of the self-destructive way in which I loved him, I didn't want to leave him when he abused me first with his words and then with his fists. I told myself I could fix him, that this wasn't who he was, not really. I let him keep showing me who he really was until I finally believed him and left. I had already lived a few lives by that time, I thought. A farm girl from Missouri, a door-to-door steak salesperson, a sex worker, a model in New York, a survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault. But I was afraid none of these lives had sufficiently prepared me to live the one I wanted more than anything else. I'd only just begun thinking of myself as a writer around that time, but I told myself I'd probably not read enough books, had not visited enough continents, was not smart enough or wise enough, didn't have anything to say, and no one would want to hear it if I did. I thought there had been a mistake in the cosmic register. Somewhere there was another Lacy Johnson who could keep straight when to use lay instead of lie, who actually belonged in all the places I began finding myself, who deserved all the good things that suddenly seemed to be happening to me. This is all to say that the worst violence that man committed was not against my body, but against the story I told about the person I believed myself to be. I was 21 when that man kidnapped and raped me and tried but failed to kill me. The man got away, and I got away. He is a fugitive living in Venezuela, and I am a writer of books. The last one I wrote was about him, about the day he meant to kill me, but I lived. It was not easy, not the writing and not the living, not until I often found myself standing in front of strangers, telling them there is justice for me in standing here, in this room, alive and breathing and telling my story with my own voice. It is not the ending to the story anyone expects, not even the one they want, because they want a return. A redemption, a retrieval of all I had lost for my part in the story. They want suffering for him. They want blood, guts, gore. Now that would be justice, they think. I'm going to skip forward slightly. To see another suffer is pleasant, Nietzsche writes. To make another suffer is still more pleasant. He's thinking in particular of how tempting it is to imagine punishment as a kind of redemption for guilt. The German word Schuld means both guilt and debt in English, and one primary meaning of the word redemption was to buy that debt back. A trick of the mind that tells us that every injury has some equivalent of pain or sacrifice. There is, as Nietzsche points out, a strange accounting in this. A crime creates a debt, the criminal becomes a debtor, the victim his creditor, whose compensation is the particular pleasure of bearing witness to a cruel and exacting punishment. Is that justice? Would I cheer and cry and jump up and down if the man who kidnapped and raped me were kidnapped and raped and beaten? If I could grind him down with my rage until there was almost nothing left of him. If I could watch him suffer in all the ways he made me suffer, or better yet, if I could cause that suffering myself. The story tells me to imagine it would feel satisfying. A release of adrenaline, or perhaps the relief from it. To be honest, I'm not sure what justice is supposed to feel like. There is a shut place I carry inside me. If I caused him to suffer, would that go away? I have found photos of him on the internet that suggest he is living in Venezuela with a woman who has given birth to 2 of his children, both girls. In the photos, he is as unhappy in his new life as he ever was in the one he lived with me. On vacation, he grows sullen because the trip isn't going his way. And when the family joins him in the ocean, he frowns and looks away from the camera, afraid of being recognized, of what the photograph will reveal. The older daughter, who is the same age as my son, sits on her mother's lap, the mother who is love and safety, who makes a wall with her body between the daughter and him. Does he notice she does this? He holds the baby a little above his lap and away from his body. At a party, he dances back and forth in front of the children and also their parents who are watching because he has an audience. And in public, he performs a version of himself who is charming, who is fun to be around, who is everything anyone ever wanted a person to be. Behind closed doors, he is angry and irritable. A man so fragile and insecure that he rages at anyone who does not reflect back the version of himself he wants to see. This is why his wife and daughters look, in the photographs, a little hollowed out inside. I can see everything he is doing to them, everything he has already done. You probably want him dead, strangers tell me. If we know in what ways society is unbalanced, we must do what we can to add weight to the lighter scale, Simone Weil once wrote. In the years since I left that man, I have fallen in love many times, made a father out of a man I met on the internet. Let's hear it for Friendster. I have created life, written whole worlds, outlined entire moral geographies for 2 barely domesticated children, and have learned to welcome the strangers who arrive at the doorstep of my soul. I've called myself a writer now more than half of my life, and during all this time I have learned that sometimes the hardest and most important work I've done has meant turning a story I couldn't tell into one that I can. And that this practice on its own is not only one of discovery, but of healing. Is justice a story about healing? Justice is blind, we are told. It is served. Maybe like a severed head on a plate. It is a destination, the path to which is long and sometimes crooked and bent. The Roman Emperor Nero called it justice when he threw Christians to the beasts in the Colosseum. For some, justice means sticking to the laws or enforcing them. For others, it means helping friends and harming enemies. Aristotle observed that justice, like language, is a special characteristic of humans. Plato suggested that justice is an inward grace. Might is right is another enduring view, might meaning violence, of course, and violence being the opposite of grace. More than anything else, What I want is a reckoning, not only for myself, not only for him. I want it for everyone who asks the question. The woman with the crepe paper hands, the man in the 10-gallon hat, the boy who burned, and his mother who must have barely lived. I want a reckoning for the woman shot in the back of the head, and the man killed while running away, for the children who survive him. I want it for the person who believes he deserves to take life, and for the person who has been sentenced to offer his. I want a reckoning for all the wars politicians ask our children to fight on their behalf, and for all the children those wars fail to protect. I want a long line of reckonings. I want our truth told back to us. I want the lies laid bare. No, I say to the woman who has asked the question from the back of the room, or from against the wall, or sitting at the head of the table. I don't want him dead. I want him to admit all the things he did to my face, in public, and then to spend the rest of his life in service to other people's joy. She leans back in her seat. This is the ending I want. I don't want him dead. I don't even want him to suffer. More pain creates more sorrow, sometimes generations of sorrow, and it amplifies injustice rather than cancels it out. I want to let go of my anger and fear and pain. I want to let go of the hatred and enmity and spite. I want that shut place I carry to open. The ending I want is inside. Okay. So that's the funny one. Just kidding. So I'm going to read a newer piece. So over the past several years after this book came out, which came out in 2018, and one of the final essays that I wrote for this was about Hurricane Harvey, which I lived through and sort of detail my experience here. But that experience also I shifted my attention to flooding in particular, both as a kind of way of thinking about environmental injustice more broadly and also thinking about climate change specifically. So I launched a project called the Houston Flood Museum and have a new book out called More City Than Water, which I edited. I didn't write it all myself, where many writers and artists are thinking about flooding in our city. But I've learned a lot about flooding in the process, and I found that thinking about flooding in Houston in particular made me want to think about my own prior experience of flooding in a different way. I had an invitation to write about landscapes altered by climate change for an anthology called The World as We Knew It, which is edited by Amy Brady and Taja Eisen. And in that invitation, I felt called to think again about the flood of 1993. And I wrote a little bit about that flood in my first book, Trespasses. But A, I think only about 5 people have read it in history, and 3 of them are in this room. And B, I found that after everything I had learned about flooding, there was more about it that I wanted to say. So what you need to know about this, and this is especially for the young people in the room, is that way back in the 1990s, when dinosaurs walked the earth and only the landmass was the supercontinent of Pangaea, telephones used to be connected to the wall by a spiral cord. So that's one thing. And also, in order to listen to your favorite songs over and over, you would record them off the radio onto cassette tapes. Do you guys know about cassette tapes? Yeah, some of you are nodding your heads. A few of you know about cassette tapes. Other people are like, what are you talking about, Pangaea? So those are the only 2 things you need to know. So this essay is called Come Hell. Very different thing. Let me take one more drink of water. There's actually vodka. All right, here we go. It started raining in the fall and kept raining even as the temperature dropped, when the rain became snow, falling like scraps of wet cloth pushed by the wind into sopping drifts. In the spring, the snow turned back to rain and kept falling, and by summer the creeks and rivers had filled and left their banks, submerging first the low farmlands, then the farmhouses and barns and steel outbuildings, and then also the train tracks, abandoned coal mines, the highways and bridges, so that an archipelago of grass and silos and trees stretched between the Missouri and Mississippi rivers from South Dakota to the Gateway Arch. The rain kept falling even through the summer, when the rivers grew to monstrous size and approached the edges of towns and then swallowed the streets. People moved their homes and businesses to higher ground to escape them. They moved entire towns. In the summer, when the rivers were widest and deepest, the days underwater accumulated 75, 97, 150. This was Missouri in 1993. A year before the rain started, my parents had sold the farm where I'd spent what felt like my entire childhood and moved into a house only 5 blocks from our church. Living so close to the pulpit meant that not even the worst flood in 75 years could keep us from attending service every Sunday morning and every Wednesday night. As thunder shook the stained glass in the sanctuary, our pastor, Brother Michael, we'll call him, told us, his faithful congregation, how God had sent the flood of the Old Testament to cleanse the earth of sin and moral depravity, how he had instructed Noah to build the ark and gather the animals, and how this flood, our flood, was also a message from God. Who among us would hear his instructions to gather to one another and to him, to be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth? Who would be obedient? God made the earth for us, Brother Michael told us from the pulpit. He made the sun for us and the rain for us, even rain that falls for an entire year. My family sat, as usual, near the rear of the church. My father nodded as Brother Michael raised his hands and his voice. The rain will cease and the clouds will part, he told us, and the rainbow God bends down from heaven will be the token of that everlasting covenant between us and him. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. God had given me as many summers on the farm as I could remember, and now that we'd moved to town, I could hardly find a thing to do. Our farm hadn't even been very big, only 76 acres, and much of that was forested, but I could spend the whole day walking the perimeter and learn the history of the weather and the shapes of the land. The way the creek bottom held a millennia of flooding in its warm black soil, the way trees on the edge of our property had died and toppled years ago in a drought. I'd straddle their trunks, close my eyes, and let the sun warm my skin. But our new house sat right next to our neighbors on both sides, and life felt enclosed and small. I could ride my bike across the entire town in less than a morning, and all I'd see were ghosts of what the town had once been. An abandoned coal elevator behind the Benjamin Franklin downtown, the sharp bare ridges of surface mines that sloped into deep black pits, the rail lines that once carried coal from the local mines to the power plant where my father worked, and now carried it from much, much farther away. When it was raining, I'd sit on the floor of my upstairs bedroom and try to record songs from the radio onto cassette tapes, while my sister read the funny pages from the newspaper in the other room. The headlines announcing the river cresting, another high water record, thousands losing access to drinking water, to electricity. Sometimes my sister and I would walk down the street to the edge of the water to throw in leaves and sticks and watch them river away. During the worst of the flooding, when my father would leave the house every morning to drive his pickup truck along the dry back roads on his way to the power plant, my mother would cross her arms and let out a long, tired sigh. I'd been to the power plant maybe only one time, but I could hold an image of it clear in my mind. The green fields cradling a deep blue lake that stretched for miles, surrounded by a forest of maple trees. At the southern tip of the lake, the land was charred black and gray, no trees, no grass, no flowers or even any weeds, and in the middle of this burnt-out place, right against the edge of the water, 3 churning smokestacks belched black smoke that on a clear day I could see from miles away. I didn't understand what my father did for work at the time, but I knew the power plant provided electricity to dozens of towns where the stoplights, attic fans, refrigerators, and single light bulbs swinging from wires in basements. I knew my father had been raised on a farm like me, and on the farm he had studied the gospel of the planting and the harvest, the cycle of hunting in the winter and swimming in the summer, and of watching fog roll down from the hills when the axis of the earth pivoted toward fall. He understood what it meant to bale hay and birth calves, and also that he didn't want to do that sweaty, back-breaking labor his whole life if he didn't have to. So he learned how to wear a collared shirt and turn coal into electricity. Now that he worked at the power plant, my father believed what Brother Michael told him in church, that coal is a blessing if we use it to power our cities, that oil is a blessing if we turn it to gasoline. God gave humans the earth, my father believed, and we please God when we use his gifts to fulfill our needs. I learned only later, after my father and I stopped speaking, that coal had once been abundant in the part of Missouri where we lived. Fields of it as wide as entire counties, scenes of it tatted under the land like black lace. But when the coal mines started to run dry and mining coal got more expensive than shipping it, the mines closed, the miners left, the town withered, and new coal, cleaner coal, started arriving from Wyoming, where miners blasted it out of the sides of mountains and scraped it from gaping black canyons before crushing it to the size of black plums. At the power plant, the coal arrived by the truckload. Hundreds of truckloads every day, where it was spray cleaned, cracked, crushed, pulverized, and burned to produce the dirtiest kind of electricity. Each ton of coal producing almost 2 tons of carbon dioxide. 1 billion tons of coal burned in the United States every year, polluting the air we try to breathe as much as all of our cars, trucks, buses, and planes combined, enough to melt glaciers in the Himalayas and ice caps on the planet's 2 poles, enough to raise the sea level of every ocean on Earth and to cause decades-long droughts that turn farmland to desert, wildfires that turn ancestral forests to ash. I don't know whether my father knew that then. I didn't know that then. All I knew was that when my father came home from work every evening, we'd gather at the dinner table, and he would ask us to bow our heads to pray. Some nights we'd thank God for the food on our table and the clothes on our backs. Other nights we'd ask God to help the men who'd lost their farms in the flood, who'd lost their jobs at the power plant, who'd lost everything. After my sister and I cleaned up all the dishes and loaded the dishwasher, my father would fall asleep in his armchair while the rain filled the streets and the news played on television, the living room flickering with footage of the swollen rivers, brown and fast and so wide in some places that I held my breath while the camera tried to take it all in. Cars underwater, crops underwater, women walking through water carrying baskets, men carrying their children on their backs, houses bobbing in the water, grain silos underwater. The weatherman ran his hands through his hair while water rushed through broken levees, baseball stadiums filled with water, men stacked sandbags outside their storefronts, coffins bobbed in shallow lakes. Semi-trucks underwater, gas stations, train cars carrying giant hogs that screamed like human women. My father believed that God is in control, that he has already ordained everything that happens, everything we do, and that the coal they burned at the power plant had no more effect on the weather than the way my father tied his shoes. I never once heard my father say the phrase global warming or climate change, not until decades later, when he had already decided he didn't believe they exist. Though I often heard him say, Heavenly Father, and Amen. One night in late summer, when the rain had finally started to let up, My father had just finished blessing our dinner when the phone rang in the kitchen. My father stood up, folded his napkin onto his plate, and walked to where the phone hung from the wall. He lifted the receiver and listened before holding it out to me. I pulled the long spiral cord into the bathroom, and a voice on the other end whispered that out where all the roads were flooded, out past our old farm, where our parents couldn't reach us, where the sheriffs couldn't go in their low-crowned Victorias, there was a place that could be ours for the night, where we could all be free. After I did the dishes with my sister and told my father some bold-faced lie about a Bible study sleepover with some friends from church, not true, never happened, I rode in the backseat of a tiny hatchback packed with more teenagers than seatbelts down a long gravel road to the flood's edge. I climbed with the others into the bed of a tall pickup truck and sat on the wheel well and held tight as the driver eased us forward into the water, so filthy with runoff that it swallowed light rather than reflecting it, and ferried us slowly to the dry ground on the other side, to wet hay bales and a fire that burned while we passed bottles and bottles of cheap alcohol. Hours later, I lay back in the wet grass and looked up into a sky of stars spinning above me, and though I wanted to feel God in everything, to feel certain of Him like my father did, all I felt was the movement of the water all around us, carrying us toward a future I couldn't yet see. The gospel I learned from the forest and the trees, the creeks and the water, the crops and the land, and the flooding that consumed them was that the earth belonged only to itself. None of it belonged to me. After the water receded and the farmland dried and the old pit mines drained and the farmers began tilling the river sand deep into the fields that produced less and less every year, my father left for work each morning, driving to the power plant on the highway instead of the back roads. And the 3 smokestacks went on belching black smoke day after day, year after year, like nothing had changed. We went to church every Sunday morning and every Wednesday night, and before dinner my father asked us to bow our heads to pray. For a while, I did pray. But in the afternoons, my sister read the funny page from the newspaper, and I sat on the floor of my bedroom recording songs from the radio onto cassette tapes while trying to imagine what I could take with me when I leave. What I loved most about that place was the warm black soil on the creek bottom, the fog rolling down from the ridge of trees, the way the wind rippled the field of grass and waves. But none of those things were mine to take, and besides, by that time, they were already gone. Thank you.
So we have time for a couple questions from the audience. Also, those of you tuning in from home, if you want to type questions into the Zoom chat, we have somebody reading those and they will be read aloud for you. But first we'll start with the audience. I'd love a student question.
So as someone who's clearly intellectually interested in flooding, one of the ways that the climate crisis is also making itself visible is in drought. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if there's any overlap in that in the sort of literary exploration of too much water.
Sure. I will say that drought is not my particular specialty, and I have not studied drought, so I can't necessarily speak to it. But I think one of the reasons that I'm looking at flooding in particular is because, when my neighborhood flooded in Hurricane Harvey, and there were something like 300,000 homes that flooded, that like 61 inches of rain in some places, enough water to have compressed the earth under the entire city of Houston, which is the size of Rhode Island, 2 centimeters. So a lot of water. And it was, you know, as you might imagine, a traumatic experience for myself and for many others, for the entire city. And part of why I felt compelled to start to work on flooding, and I'll promise I'll get to drought in a moment, so just, part of why I wanted to work on flooding, or why I felt like I wanted to focus on it for a little while, was, you know, after we sort of fled our neighborhood, when it seemed like the water was gonna come into our house and we had to escape, we went over to a friend's house in a neighborhood that had not flooded, right? And, you know, there were a few tree limbs down, but like buses were running, and like you could have pizza delivered, and it was like nothing had happened, you know, and, you know, people were at the coffee shop talking about Game of Thrones, and it was wild because on the other side of the city, you're still very much in active disaster mode, like airboats flying up and down the street rescuing people from their homes. And one day I went for a run while I was at my friend's house, and I saw this sort of stream of water coming into the street, and I was like, oh God, you know, water, and it was sort of sudsy, and I sort of followed it, and there was a man washing his car in the driveway, and the water was going into the storm drain. And that seems like maybe not such a big deal, but his water going into the storm drain means that other storm drains are not draining, right? And, you know, it all goes to the same place. And just, I got so frustrated at the kind of disconnect, the way that these people who had been completely spared this terrible disaster did not recognize their good fortune in that, or the way in which their, what we call in Houston, dry privilege was, came at the expense of the people who had flooded, right? That it's connected, that there's amnesia. And then, you know, a month after Harvey, the City Council of Houston voted unanimously to allow development in the floodplain. And so I was like, you know, just wanting to like shake people and go like, don't you realize, you know, and so, you know, for me, flooding, like that's why it was flooding for me. And then, you know, when I thought back, you know, I remembered this flood of '93 as being maybe my first experience with a climate disaster, with a disaster caused by climate change. And so, but I think that, like, the climate crisis as a whole is like so impossible to get our heads around, right? Or to think of any particular solutions, because it's so massive. And it's everywhere, and it's happening everywhere in different ways and in different kind of amplifications. And so the reason I wanted to look at flooding was just, it's one part of that, and it allows us to see some things that when we try to look at the whole get muddied a little bit because it's so complicated. So looking at flooding in particular, and flooding in Houston, you know, I realized flooding isn't new. Like the first time Houston flooded was the year after it was founded. And it's flooded something like 86 times since. It isn't neutral, meaning that the people, you know, the rain falls equally on us, but when it lands on the ground, it intersects with history, with a history of redlining and gentrification. With a history of, you know, the Flood Act of 1936, which says that any flood mitigation project is evaluated based on the value of the property protected, not only the people who are protected. So wealthy neighborhoods almost always get flood mitigation projects, and poor neighborhoods almost never do. And at this point, it's not an accident, right? There's, Houston is built, you know, pavement the size of Rhode Island, on land that used to be wetlands and coastal prairie. And it's a little bit disingenuous to talk about flooding in a place like that, because it's not a flood when a wetland fills with water, right? It's a flood when we pave over the coastal prairie. You know, the prairie grass acts like a sponge. It opens up the clay soils that otherwise act like a bowl, and without them, we are just sort of like inviting water to happen in the first place. So I'm looking at flooding just because that's my experience, but if you have an experience with drought, I really encourage you to sort of just spend some time dedicated to sort of thinking about drought and inviting people to come into that work with you. That was a very long answer to your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Oh, there's a question there.
So I'm curious, like between the time that that event happened and now, like how have the attitudes toward climate change changed, I guess? And like, do you think there's more hope than there was when this flood happened? And just like your opinion or perspective on that.
Sorry, the time since the flood of 93?
Yeah, like I'm just curious about how attitudes toward climate change have changed, if at all, between then and now. And if you think there's like more hope of combating climate change now or not.
Hope is not really my ministry. Here's what I'll say about hope, and I write about this a little bit in The Reckonings. Like, hope is not optimism, right? There's a big difference between optimism and hope. Optimism is the belief that, like, everything's going to turn out okay no matter what we do. Like, everything's going to be fine. You know, and pessimism is the opposite of that, where, like, nothing that we do can make anything good happen, so we might as well not. But optimism is also kind of it doesn't require anything of us, right? It says that we don't need to act in any particular way because everything's going to be fine. And hope is a little bit different from that, according to Václav Havel. He says that hope is an orientation of the spirit. And it is a belief that things are worth doing not because of any outcome that may come about, but because we believe it's the right thing to do, right? That something good, not that something good will happen or that it has to happen, but something good can happen, right? If we act in ways that allow it to become possible. So, you know, I think attitudes about climate change have changed. My dad still doesn't believe in climate change. And, you know, I feel frustrated with that, but also it makes sense. I mean, he worked at a coal-fired power plant his whole career. And if he believed in climate change, then maybe he would have to go like, oh, I personally did that. And that might be really hard for the ego to take in, right? So maybe it's more convenient for him to say, like, there's no such thing. And also, I think it doesn't fit with his, you know, religious worldviews. But I think action has changed, right? It hasn't changed enough, but it's changing some all the time, every day. Like, there are constantly things that people are doing in large and small ways. You know, there's an enormous effort to close coal-fired power plants, and they have success. There's, you know, things that I don't necessarily believe that, like, individual actions are the key, but, you know, collective action is key, and it does seem to be working. The last thing I would say about hope is that it has to do with the sort of trope in science fiction, stay with me for a minute, about time travel, right? We kind of accept in time travel movies that you can go to the past and do something small that radically alters the present that you live in, like you go back in the present's unrecognizable. Think like Back to the Future, right? I mean, probably some people are like, what's Pangea? Back to the Future, it must have happened there. But there's a movie, Back to the Future anyway. He goes back to the past and changes one small thing, and he comes back to the present, and his present is radically altered. But one thing that we don't tend to accept quite as much is that there are small things that we can do in the present that radically alter the future, right? And that's what I think, that's the thing that gives me hope, is that there are things, like, we don't know what the future will be, and we have to do our best in the here and now. This light here is wild and unpredictable. It has been drinking the vodka.
This one is from Catherine from afar. Catherine asks, how did you navigate the process of writing through the trauma that you endured without letting it overcome you? Was writing part of your healing process?
I think I heard the question. It's how do I cope with the trauma while I'm writing, and has it been a healing process? Yes, profoundly healing. Not the writing itself, I will say. The writing, it's not that you write about trauma and then you're like, well, thank God that's over. Like, now I'm going to go back and live my life as it was before. That's not what it was. I think what it has changed for me is it has changed my relationship to the events. I still have trauma. Like, I still suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. I still have nightmares. I still don't like to sit with my back to the door. Like, those things are all real and true, and they haven't changed. But what has changed is that I don't feel afraid of the story itself, right? For a really long time, I couldn't even tell the story, right? Much less tell it in public, right? I couldn't tell it to my beloved. I couldn't tell it to people who were close to me. There was like a sort of short, maybe 2-sentence version, which was the only one that I could manage to articulate. And I felt like it had a lot of power over me, and it was making my decisions on my behalf, that the sphere was making my decisions for me. And it was making my life quite small. And so writing about it was difficult. Like, there were many days when I was, crying or couldn't do it, or, sort of, there was definitely brought up, it was triggering. It brought up all that trauma right to the surface. And then when the story was told, I felt like my relationship to the story had changed. That I can walk up and touch those memories, and they don't have the same kind of electric charge that they used to. And so if that's what we call healing, then yes, it has been healing. I'm able to be a public person now, which I wasn't before. I was very private. I was in hiding. Like, I hardly even left the house. Obviously, that's very different now. So it has certainly changed my life to have written about it and to have been received in communities like this one very lovingly. That has also been profoundly healing. Yeah. Okay, shout it out.
Okay, you talked about like burning music on the cassette tape from the radio. I was just wondering if you have like a writing playlist or like a score that you listen to that just inspires you.
Yeah, I like that you said burning music onto the cassette tape, because all the olds up here in the front, we know that's like the thing that you do to CDs, right? But you just sort of like, you hit the record and the play at the same time. You go click, and then it goes shh, and then it's recording. I actually do have a playlist that I listen to when I'm writing sometimes. I also like to write in total silence. I can't listen to anything with lyrics. It really messes me up. So anything, unless it's like in a language that I don't speak, which is most of them, or I like to be in like a coffee shop where there's a lot of kind of like murmuring happening. But the playlist, there's a playlist on Spotify called Dark Academia, which is there's multiple playlists called Dark Academia, but the one that Spotify made is key. It's very choice. So that's the one that I listen to. There's symphonies, they're like crescendos, and I'm like, I'm writing the shit out of this sentence. Great. Ta-da! Period. Yeah. So I like that.
Okay, we'll call this the last one.
I was just wondering, for the first piece, the structure that you had, where you keep coming back to this idea of justice and what does it mean, and then the woman question and kind of like that pattern of that, like, is that a structure that you thought of from the beginning, or is it something that you kind of made your way to in the writing process?
So the way that I teach structure in my own classes is that I'm gonna sort of put on my TG hat for just a second here. So I say that what we bring to an essay in different measures is we bring a sense of mastery, a sense of mystery, and a sense of mania. And mania is another way of saying obsession, but I like the 3 M's, mastery, mystery, mania, right? And so there's something about the subject matter that you can be an expert in, even if you aren't already when you begin, but you can do research, you can sort of learn how to know more than your audience does about the subject matter, right? And that might be your personal experience, it might be books that you read, it might be things that you look up, it might be like people that you go talk to. But that sort of expertise comes through. Then the mania is the part of it that bothers you, the part that like gets under your skin and is like, I'm thinking about this and I can't stop thinking about it, and I think I'm gonna write an essay about it, right? And so for me, that's that question, like, what do you want to have happen to him? That bothered me. Like, why would people think that I wanted him to die? Like, this is a person I had spent several years of my life with, who I had loved. And yes, of course, like he did terrible things, but why would you think I would want him dead? And so that thing that bothered me, so then I started like researching about justice and the history of justice, right? And, you know, thinking about that sort of like eye for an eye, which we think of as a biblical thing, but it actually goes back to the Code of Hammurabi, right? And the interesting thing about the Code of Hammurabi is that it wasn't meant as eye for an eye. It didn't mean that you had to take an eye. It meant nothing more than an eye. It was like a limit on retribution. So what was happening in ancient Burma was that you were, someone was stealing their neighbor's cow, and that person would respond by like slaughtering the whole family. And so they're like, you can't do that. You have to, it's just like you take a cow, you get a cow, that's it, right? So upper limit. But that's not the way that we use that term now, right? We use it as like, well, you did this, so I'm gonna do this, like it has to be. And so I was like, well, what is it about our contemporary moment that is compelling us toward this misunderstanding of ancient law, right? What is it about the way that we experience pain and grief and damage that cause us to want to sort of, this causes us retributive hatred, right? And so that was the question that then I was thinking about. And that's the mystery, that's the mastery, mystery, mania, is that you form a question. And so what you see happening in that structure is me thinking, like touching on each of those impulses, right? There's this sort of like thing where I go off and I'm gonna research and I'm gonna talk about Nietzsche for a little bit, but I'm gonna come back to the thing that bothers me, which is this question that people keep asking me. But the question that I have is, what is justice if it's not this? Does that answer your question? So, okay, good.
Okay, it is now time to do the right thing and go buy some books that we have in the back, both for Jenny, which we didn't have in her reading, and also for Lacy. Lacy, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.